Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome in for today. Today we have part 3 out of the series of making an old computer breathe new life again. Well, today's topic is going to be about cooling and repasting and what you can do to get your thermal efficiency is kind of as good as it's going to get. And so the first thing is going to be fan flow, orientation, and optimizing of the case. To a lot, this may seem like a no-brainer, but it can be a very easily overlooked step with fan orientation, especially if you buy a used computer or if you're building one and you just aren't thinking about it and you quickly slap it together. You can put a fan in the wrong direction, and if you have a big enough case, you may not see an issue with it, or if you're water cooling, you may not see an issue with it. But if you're the smaller the case, the more that will be an impact, and the newer hardware you're running, that is the more heat producing ones, the greater the issue that can become. Now, if you're not familiar with it, a lot of fans have the markings on them, and some will tell you the blade rotation. Like this one, it's rotating in a clockwise formation and the airflow is blowing towards the cage. And there are a few exceptions, but most of the fans, you will have them blowing towards the cage, so the airflow will go wherever the cage is pointing. That's where the air is going to be going. Now say this is the front of the computer and this would be the back of the computer, and your motherboard would be sitting in there like so. You'd want, in a typical format, have your fronts be your intake, because you'll have a mesh filter on the front, and then you'll have your back and your tops as your exhaust. Now, if you have this fan blowing this way and you have your exhaust blowing this way, you will really want to make sure that your tower cooler, if you have one, the fan is matching the direction. And you can have a double stack cooler with 2 fans or even 3 fans with one in the center, and you want to make sure all of them are matching the airflow. You don't want the fans blowing air like this into each other. And that can be a really easily overlooked step that may get missed when you're putting the computer together. If you're in a hurry, tired, just not thinking about it, it happens to the best of us. And then the biggest thing is if you have multiple fans on your cooler in a push-pull configuration, or push-pull with one in the center, again, you want to make sure they're all in the same orientation. You don't slot one in the wrong way and these 2 fans that then are fighting each other this way. So in the last video, I mentioned about downloading CPU ID Hardware Monitor. That's a really good piece of software for tracking any and all temperatures and sensors on your computer. So if you're noticing your CPU or GPU temperature isn't quite right and it's running a little on the hot side, if you think it's your case, one of the easy ways that you can do to check that real quick is once you're in game, you've been in a game for a while and your computer is completely heat soaked and it's hot as it's gonna get, pull the side cover off. If you take the side cover off and your temperatures drastically drop, then that means you have a lot of optimization in your case, because you have something wrong with the airflow. It's either not exhausting hot enough, it's not exhausting the hot air out, or you have a choke point and it's not breathing cold air in. Typically you want to run a balanced air pressure. I tend to run a little bit more on the positive side for pressure. I don't like to run a negative pressure. I tend to be on a little bit on the positive, but not by much. But if you pull the side cover off and you notice that there's not a big swing in temperature, then your case isn't an issue and you'll have to look elsewhere. For repasting, one of the things that I recommend is about repasting your CPU and GPU about every 5 years or so. With cheaper paste, they tend to dry out relatively quickly. All thermal paste can and will dry out at some point. The difference from cheap thermal paste to a high-end thermal paste is purely the fact of longevity for a normal use case. Now the high-end stuff like KPX, Thermal Grizzly, Cryonaut Extreme, that stuff is made purely for XOC, extreme overclocking people, guys that run liquid nitrogen to cool everything down. That stuff works phenomenal and is designed for that. For a normal use case, it works really well. But from a cheap stuff to that high-end stuff, you're only going to notice about a 5 degrees C drop in temperature. Now that can help And if the paste that you're replacing is really bad and old and clayed up, it can be obviously a bigger swing than that, but from application to application, you're only going to notice about a 5 degrees C. The biggest difference is going to be longevity. The cheaper stuff is going to dry up 3 to 5 years, depending on how many heat cycles you put it through. If you're constantly gaming on it, it's going to dry up relatively quickly. Once it dries up, your temperature is going to go up. With like KPX or Thermal Grizzly Cryonaut Extreme, that stuff will stay liquidy longer, and it will take a lot longer to dry up. And then when you do go to replace it, since it's going to be in more of a liquidy state, it'll be a lot easier to wipe up, clean, and apply new stuff, versus when it's clayed up, you got to scrape it off and soak it in ice alcohol and really kind of work with it to get it off. That's going to be the biggest difference. Now, if you're not worried about the longevity or the temperature and cost is a thing, definitely go with the cheap stuff like Arctic Silver 5. It's been around forever. It does its job. It's not amazing by any means. It does dry up, but it works. MX5 is another one. Not groundbreaking formula or anything like that, but it works. So it's all of them. You're going to have to look at yours because all of them are going to be different. But this one is all spring tension, and some of them with the AMD you will find spring tension if they utilize the factory spring clips that AM4 comes with. I believe AM5 is that way. I don't have an AM5, so don't quote me on that one. But if you do have, if your cooler does have a spring tension, then you'll have to kind of play around with it to see how to take it off and how to put it back on. It should be fairly simple, just the 2 springs once you have the actual mounting mechanism to the board. You won't have to remove anything to clean it off. You just gently kind of scrub it off a little bit. Use alcohol, 99%. The higher the percentage, the better. If you start using cheap stuff, like the lower percentage alcohol, there's a lot more additives and stuff that's not filtered out, and so that can leave a residue on there which could play with your temperatures. So I definitely recommend using anything close to about 99%, or if you can find it, 99% works really well, breaking down the thermal paste. Now, one of the things that people do from time to time is they will use a microfiber to clean it off. Do not use a microfiber if you're doing thermal paste. Don't use it on laptops, GPUs, desktops. Don't do it. The fibers are very strong with microfiber, and they will rip off all of these SMDs on the motherboard, and they definitely will. Those fibers do not tear. I like to use blue shop towels. You can get them relatively cheap. AutoZone, Napa, Riley's, Costco. Get them in big packs. They will not rip off the SMDs. They will just tear the blue shop towels. If you let it soak, it will work relatively well. Instead of just trying to like get in there and scrub it, get a bunch of alcohol on a paper towel. And you can use regular paper towels too. I like to use stuff that is lint free, so that way it doesn't kind of just leave fibers everywhere. But if you get it wet with IPA and you kind of just let it sit, it will start to dissolve it and break it down. So instead of having to like sit there and just continuously scrub, if you just kind of soak it a little bit and then you can wipe it out, it'll work a lot easier. Now, don't worry about if thermal paste is on the edges. If it's on the edge or even in the socket, well, not the socket, but like around the actual IHS down into the side of it, don't worry about it. It's not gonna make a it's not gonna matter. Don't worry about it. If you prefer being clean and cleanliness, that's one thing, but as for actual use, it won't matter, won't harm it. It will be perfectly fine. And then you'll just keep working at it until it all comes off. I just pasted this not long ago, so this is still really fresh, so that's why it's coming off. really easy. But you'll just keep working at it, and eventually it'll come clean. But I'm just trying to give you guys a comparison in case you haven't seen IHS versus a direct die silicone before. This will be your IHS, so this will be your CPU. This is the integrated heat spreader that the cooler sits on and then transfers the heat through. And then you'll obviously want to clean out the cooler as well, whether that's a water block for a custom loop cooler, an AIO, air cooler. You want to make sure that you clean both sides. And so with that, that is what I'm going to break down for this portion. From here, what I'm going to wind up doing is breaking down this EVGA 1070 Ti, just that way you can then get an actual comparison between that and this. Now, I will say right now, this has already been, you can see the sticker right here. This is the screw that was there with that sticker. The void of warranty stickers, and almost all graphics cards will more than likely have them. In the United States, that does not matter. They cannot void your warranty for a void of warranty removed or tampered with sticker in the United States. In the United States, it doesn't hold any legal ground. If they see that, the companies can and will try to bully you and pressure you into, not going through with it. They don't have any legal grounds to stand on. Us at this channel at Techno Tinker, we are a big supporter of the right to repair. Everything I do with this channel is to try to give you guys as much knowledge and confidence into doing your own repairs or upgrades or tearing stuff apart, and not having having the confidence to do it, like repasting your graphics card. And so do not be alarmed with that sticker. In the United States, they don't have any legal grounds. They will try to pressure you and kind of bully you into it. Some companies won't. There are a lot of companies that will, unfortunately, but they don't have any legal grounds to stand on with that, so you can push right back. It's a desktop like what I just took apart. If it's got, it'll have the 4 screws. Same thing with the laptop, handhelds, doesn't matter. If it has a heatsink, it's gonna have 4 screws. If you remove these 4 screws and it's not a spring clamp, you want to make sure that when you are both taking it off but more importantly putting it back together, that you do them in increments and you do them in a star pattern like you would lug nuts on your car. When you do your lug nuts on your car, you want to do them in a star pattern. You want to do this the exact same way, and you want to do them in increments. I like to do them in thirds. So I'll go through 3 times until it's fully seated. These will bottom out. So once they kind of get snug is fine. Do not torque on them, because the threads will bottom out, and the springs is what is going to hold the tension and the pressure on it. You're not physically going to apply pressure to it with the screws. It is the springs that is going to do it. Now, if you haven't taken apart a graphics card, this can be the part that is a little bit more daunting, because once you go to take it apart, it's going to have a lot of resistance on it, and you may feel like you are kind of over pulling on it, but as long as you have all the screws out and you're not really flexing the PCB, it will be perfectly fine. Now, every brand of card is going to be different. Every trim and model of card is going to be different. Where Asus, MSI is all going to be different than EVGA, and the generations are going to be different from the 10 series to the 20 series, 30s to the 40s. They're all going to be different, so you'll have to kind of make sure when you're taking yours apart that you're paying attention to different things. There can be some hidden screws on the actual shield back here. You want to make sure that there's no screws going into the actual cooler. If there is, you want to make sure you remove these two. So if you're trying to take it apart and you're having issues, take a look back there. Now, if your thermal paste is dried up and you have thermal pads on there, this can be very hard to take apart. And like I said, I've already had this card apart once before, so it's not too bad for me. Everything is relatively easily kind of coming apart. You want to make sure that all of the wires do come out and you don't yank on it, because you can hurt the wires, kind of like this one right here. And so that's why you want to be careful. I find it a little bit easier when it's pulled apart a little bit to do that. And if there's any thermal pads, which this one doesn't, oh no, it does right there. This one has one. You want to make sure if they do rip, that is fine. It's not a worry if it does rip. Just gently kind of put it back. Just make sure they do not overlap each other. If they overlap each other, then the issue that you can have is this will push up on the cooler a little bit too much, and you'll have uneven mounting pressure on the actual die itself. And so you can have an issue with that. Now, if you buy a used graphics card, I recommend doing this and just taking it apart anyways. It's cheap insurance to take it apart and repaste it. If you buy a used computer from somebody, just repaste the CPU and the GPU. It's super cheap insurance to know that you have new thermal paste on there. It's not dried, it's not cracked. You can also take a soft bristle toothbrush with isoalcohol and really start scrubbing into the inside of the cooler in here and start working all the dust out. And you can even go in here, start cleaning all this out if you really wanted to. This won't necessarily make a difference, but you could if you wanted to. And that way you know you're not having a card that is going to be having thermal issues because it's caked with debris in here. A microfiber is you have all these tiny little SMDs right there, and that's going to be what's going to rip off with the microfiber. Now, don't worry about getting isopropyl alcohol down into the board or anything like that, even on a desktop. Isopropyl alcohol, because it doesn't have power on it, it's just sitting here. Isopropyl alcohol will evaporate, and so you don't have to worry about it kind of sitting in like water. It will evaporate out. You do not have to worry about it, and there's also no power applied to it. And you'll just kind of gently work it out. Now, your thermal paste may be a little bit more on the clay side, and that is perfectly fine. And what I do is try to get this kind of into a little tip like that, and just kind of gently clean it off. Something like that. Now, I'm using Thermal Grizzly Cryonaut. I have Cryonaut Extreme. I'm not using Extreme for these applications. I use that for current gen hardware due to the cost of the Extreme. But I really love Thermal Grizzly products. And one of the things that I do that will be kind of a hit or miss, some people won't necessarily agree with it. I like to frost. I really do. I like to frost my CPU or GPU or whatever I'm doing. It is very cheap insurance to frost it than to put a little dot on it. And the reason why is because the silicon nowadays is getting so much bigger that the old method of just applying a little pea-sized dot to it isn't really working anymore. You're starting to get to a situation where it is under what it's supposed to be. And so when you go to pull off the heatsink, then you're running into an issue where there's still spots on there that didn't have thermal paste on it. Now that's not so much of an issue with something as an IHS like a CPU, but for laptops, handhelds, GPUs, anything that has direct die silicon like this and it doesn't have a heat spreader, you want to make sure that it is fully covered edge to edge. Otherwise you'll wind up in a situation where you're looking at the temperatures and everything will look perfectly fine, but then you look at the edge temp and the edge temp is drastically higher than the actual temp of the socket. And that's where you're going to run into thermal throttling issues. Now, if you just frost the whole thing to begin with and not rely on the mounting pressure to squish it out evenly, it's cheap insurance to know that now that's not possible because you frosted the entire thing edge to edge. So that eliminates the issue of now having to question whether your mounting pressure was even or accurate, where if you do it yourself, you eliminate that. And you don't need very much. A little bit goes a long ways. And if you don't have a spreader, or if yours doesn't come with a little spatula, all of my Thermal Grizzly orders have always included a little tiny spatula. If yours doesn't, you can use an old credit card and just kind of cut a little spatula looking shape out of one of them. Or if you have a 3D printer, you can 3D print a little spatula. And so I like to do something quite like that. Nice, easy, nothing complicated. But this is the little spatula that Thermal Grizzly comes with. At least all of my orders have so far. And so then to put it back together is literally going to be in the reverse order. And like I said, if these thermal pads tend to rip, it's perfectly fine. Just put them back together. It won't hurt anything. Just make sure they do not overlap. That is the biggest thing. If they overlap, then you're going to take away the height difference and you're possibly going to make it to where you're going to have more gap on the socket. You're going to run hotter. So you want to make sure that it's kind of evenly put together, but you won't have any issues with the MOSFETs or the memory chips or anything like that. The only time that would matter is if there was a thermal pad for a actual socket. So like a laptop, if a laptop had a thermal pad, you'd want to make sure if it tore, you replaced it with a new thermal pad. But that is it for this. It's just a matter of replacing it back the way we put it together. Part 4 is going to be a really good one with the CPU bottlenecking. So stay tuned for that one. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell notification to stay tuned for the next week video. I hope you guys have a good day, and until next time.